They were the harbingers of death and destruction across the entire Pacific Theater, the bane of the United States Navy, and the instruments by which Japan butchered the armies of China and much of Southeast Asia. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero, Japan's iconic World War II fighter plane, gained an unmatched reputation during its time in service, not just for its cutting-edge design, but for the cunning, fanatical pilots who took it into battle. In its 5 years of service, the Zero would make an indelible impact on the war in the Pacific as a dreaded and ruthlessly effective spectre over every battlefield that it touched. And in the close of the war, it would add a new level to its reputation, that of a kamikaze plane, a suicide craft packed with explosives willfully destroyed in the name of the Emperor. The Mitsubishi Motors Corporation is best known today for its line of affordable, family-friendly cars, but much like the Volkswagen, Saab, and a long list of other modern auto manufacturers, the company has a long and often overlooked wartime history. Founded in 1928, the Mitsubishi Aircraft Company quickly made a name for itself producing biplanes, triplanes, and eventually monoplanes for both land-based and aircraft carrier use, as a major part of Imperial Japan's efforts to militarize and pursue major power status. But although Mitsubishi's early design went a long way in helping Japan expand into Korea and Manchuria, they weren't going to be enough to fight a sustained war against the Soviet Union, the United States, or any other global power. And now we've covered Japan's broader push for war readiness in our Countdown to War series over on the War of Graphics channel, so feel free to check that out if you'd like to learn more. But to put it simply, Japan spent most of the 1930s trying to build its military readiness without pissing off any massive and potentially unfriendly nations until it acquired enough warfighting equipment to meet them head-to-head. In practice, this tightrope act meant that Japan had to snap up territory and resources as quickly and as quietly as it could, while funneling everything it gathered into the maw of its military-industrial complex. By 1937, this process was going well enough, quickly enough, that Japan could afford to invest in fighter planes whose capabilities would far outmatch anything that its regional rival China had to offer. Japan's new planes would be in preparation for a long war, and Mitsubishi, along with the Nakajima Company, was invited to submit a proposal. The Imperial Japanese military was looking for a carrier-based fighter plane, and they had a very specific set of requirements for the winning proposal. The new fighter would have to be able to fly at a top speed of at least 500 kilometers per hour, 310 miles per hour, at 4,000 meters or 13,000 feet. It would have to be able to climb 3,000 meters in under 10 minutes, and by carrying a pair of drop tanks, it would have to be able to fly for at least 2 hours at a time, or 6 to 8 hours at a significantly slower cruising speed. The Zero would need to be able to carry 2 cannons, 2 machine guns, and 2 bombs, with a complete radio set, maneuverability at least as good as the Imperial Army's prior fighter jet, the A5M, and a wingspan of less than 12 meters in order to fit as many as possible onto the Imperial Navy's aircraft carriers. At the time, this was an extremely tall order, and the Nakajima Company actually pulled themselves out of the bidding competition entirely, believing that it just couldn't be done. But Mitsubishi stuck it out, and their design team, headed by Chief Engineer Ichiro Horikoshi, got to work testing out ways to bring the Navy the plane they wanted. The Navy's specifications on weapons, payloads, and radio equipment inherently added a lot of weight to the plane's structure. So in order to get to the speed and maneuverability the Navy was demanding, the new plane would have to pay for it in weight. Horikoshi's first order of business was to trim out anything and everything from the plane that wasn't explicitly necessary to either make it fly or to make sure that it filled the Navy's requirements, and using a top-secret, very light aluminium alloy, he put together a prototype, the A6M. Horikoshi and his team sacrificed armor around the pilot and the engine. They sacrificed modern self-sealing fuel tanks, and they stripped out considerable mass from the rest of the structure, meaning that although their plane would be very well armed and highly maneuverable, it would also be very fragile and more vulnerable to enemy fire than most planes of the era. The finished product was presented to the Japanese Navy, and it was promptly accepted and given the designation of Type Zero, which later would be shortened to just Zero. The plane that the Navy received hit every expectation that they wanted, and more. It flew at a gross weight of 2,800 kilograms, about 3 tons, and a wingspan of exactly 12 meters, with enough fuel to give it a range of 1,900 kilometers or about 1,160 miles. It had a top speed of 533 kilometers an hour, that's 331 miles an hour, and a cruising speed of 333 kilometers an hour, so it exceeded the Navy's hopes in terms of speed, and it was also able to climb to an altitude of 6,000 meters or 20,000 feet in just 7.5 minutes. That's double the altitude the Navy had asked for in 2 minutes less than they expected to be feasible. This fuselage was built in one piece, including its wings, which lent the Zero a far stronger overall frame than its Allied counterparts. The plane was powered by a 14-cylinder, 940-horsepower piston engine, and it would carry a single crew member packing the required 2 cannons, 2 guns, and 2 bombs. From the pilot's perspective, the controls were simple and effective, with everything a pilot needed and nothing they didn't. With wings set low in the fuselage, wide retractable landing gear, and an entirely enclosed cockpit, the plane was really advanced for its time, with an exceptionally low stall speed and a level of maneuverability that allowed it to outturn any and every Allied fighter plane of the era. The plane was exceptional, and by the time Japan was ready to attack Pearl Harbor, 521 Zero fighters were already available. A total of almost 11,000 would be produced over the course of the war. The Zero first cut its teeth in the skies over China, where it was more than a match for the biplanes and the early monoplanes of the Chinese Nationalistic Air Force. Many Japanese pilots had already been gaining valuable experience in the war, and with a modern fighter plane like the Zero, they could show off their training and abilities with virtual impunity. In the Zero's first combat sortie, a group of 13 Zeros under the command of Lieutenant Saburo Shinido attacked a group of 34 Soviet-built biplanes and monoplanes flown by the Chinese nationalists, and despite being outnumbered nearly 3-1, the Zeros shot down all but one of the enemy fighters without taking a single loss. Various estimates place the Zero's air-to-air kill numbers between 100 and 250 during their time in China prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, with only negligible losses on the Japanese side. But by 1941, Japan had pivoted its attention to the United States, where, despite the Zero's limited numbers at the time, it presented a threat that American pilots had little idea of how to deal with. Because of their success in China, Japanese pilots often believed their plane to be all but invincible in a dogfight, and strategic planners considered a single Zero capable of dealing with between 2 and 5 enemy planes at the same time. Between their range and their performance, the Zeros were unmatched in the first months of war, and between their campaign in the Pacific and against British holdings in the East Indies, they would claim 471 kills, accounting for the vast majority of destroyed enemy planes. Its maneuverability was the backbone of its effectiveness, which made the plane almost impossible to catch during high-paced, spiraling, acrobatic dogfights, and even the famed British Supermarine Spitfire had an exceptionally difficult job trying to deal with it. This more than made up for the Zero's relatively low speed too. Good luck catching up to it if it could just turn off, avoid incoming fire, and then show up directly behind you. Zeros became an integral part of the Pacific theater. Both sides developed tactics to accommodate the plane as a combat innovation. Japanese pilots adopted tactics referred to as shot high, where they would be grouped into 3 airplane units, with the flight leader flying far ahead of 2 wingmen. This had dual purposes. When attacking, the entire squadron wouldn't hit a target together, but instead fire continually, one after another. When they were attacked, they were spaced far enough apart that they could break formation instead of being trapped, and provide cover for each other as they slowly got the better of their dogfights. The Allies, though, made their own innovations as they quickly picked up on the Zero's vulnerabilities. Although it was devilishly hard to catch in a dogfight, it could often be taken out by a single burst of fire because of the complete lack of armor plating. Allied planes took to attacking the Zeros from above, diving toward them at altitude while firing short cannon bursts and then going back up to altitude again. These were known as boom and zoom tactics, also popular with the so-called Thatch Weave, introduced by Lieutenant Commander John S. Thatch, where pilots would fly in pairs and wait for a Zero to lock onto one of them. Once it did, the 2 fighters would turn towards each other, with the one under fire, bringing the Zero directly into his wingman's crosshairs. Altogether, the tactics were enough to start leveling the playing field for American P-40 and F-4F fighters, which could now at least take the Zero out of its element without having to directly compete. As the war dragged on, the Zero's task became somewhat more difficult. Not only did American and British pilots now understand how to counter the plane's vulnerabilities, but it was vulnerable to anti-aircraft gunners who were getting increasingly proficient in their work. Individual battles, specifically the Battle of Midway and the Battle of the Coral Sea, would claim the lives of many of the most experienced Zero pilots in the war, some who were shot down in the skies, some who were killed on their aircraft carriers, and some who were forced to run out of fuel over the open ocean after their aircraft carrier had been sunk. Granted, they still were racking up huge numbers of air-to-air kills, but now as many Zeros were being lost in battle as enemy planes. Not only that, but even in easier battles, the Zero worked so well because it was built for the pilot to be considered expendable. The problem with that comes when the enemy begins to shoot down more top-tier pilots than Japan could reasonably produce, leaving only subpar replacements in their place. Then there were the new Allied fighters that came onto the scene. The P-38 Lightning, produced by Lockheed, was armed to the teeth and more than capable of shredding a Zero with a quick blast from its guns, whereas the Grumman F-6F Hellcat and the Vought F-4U Crosshair combined overwhelming firepower with impressive durability and far more powerful engines. If the Zero's maneuverability had still been a surprise, then it likely would have kept some competitive edge, but now, with American airmen so keenly aware of what the Zero could or couldn't do, they were able to reduce its combat effectiveness by a remarkable degree. The Zero was an attack plane, and it was a damn good attack plane, but it was only an attack plane. It was built not to bring its pilot home, and more often, Japan was paying the price. During these years, Japan introduced a wide range of variants to improve on the Zero's core design. The Model 21, a version with folding wingtips that made up most of the early Zeros, was gradually replaced with the Model 22 and Model 32 designs, which included some wing redesigns, could hit higher altitudes, carried more ammunition, and in the case of the 22, could fly at a longer range. The Model 52 variant would ultimately be the most effective, even despite the fact that it entered the fight after the Zero had been largely figured out. Some of the Model 52s were modified to be night fighters, while others featured thick pilot armor in order to attack American B-29 bombers. But all these improvements in design were undermined by another, more pressing issue: the quality of Japanese fuel, which was dropping off significantly now that the Empire was beginning to burn through its resources. At times, this fuel led to the planes leaving a long trail of black smoke behind them, and it decreased the plane's overall ability to perform. Japanese tacticians attempted to modify their formations in order to bring a bigger pack of Zeros into each dogfight, but that was a largely irrelevant change. By then, the plane's issues were just too many to bear. The Zero's kill ratios continued to drop. At the start of the war, one Zero had been worth almost a dozen enemy planes. At the halfway point, one Zero was worth one enemy plane. Closer to the end, it took about 10 Zeros to be survivable against an Allied aircraft. As Japan became more and more desperate and the Allies began to draw closer and closer to the home islands, the Zero fighter turned from a bastion of Japanese air power to one of its last lines of defense. In just a few short years, the plane had become obsolete, but what it now lacked in operational capability, its pilots more than made up for in pure, fanatical devotion to their emperor. According to some sources, they also made up for it by being given a whole lot of crystal meth, but there are experts on both sides of that argument. What isn't up for debate is that at the tail end of the war, the Zero was repurposed from a dogfighter into a suicide attack aircraft. Although the plane was already nearly as light as it could get, the Zero was now given a 250-kilogram bomb more than capable of blasting through the tops of most Allied surface vessels. They accommodated the weight of the bomb by giving back its weight in fuel. After all, the Zero could now be making one-way trips with no hope of returning home. In the cockpit, war-hardened combat pilots were replaced by young, ideologically hardened but hardly experienced servicemen whose sole purpose behind the throttle was to get their planes to ram into an enemy ship. Shooting down enemy planes was unnecessary. Dropping ordnance on enemy ships was unnecessary. Even survival was unnecessary. While it would be a bit off topic to detail just how the indoctrination of these pilots worked, suffice it to say that the Kamikaze saw themselves as divine protectors of the Japanese home islands. From a purely logistical perspective too, it bears repeating that the Zero just wasn't much use anywhere else on the battlefield. Even though Japan had no real replacement for the fighters, there was only minimal value in continuing to put them in the skies where they might bring down one enemy plane, but at the expense of 3 or 5 or 10 of their own. But strap them with high explosives, fuel, and 2+ tons of aircraft frame, and they could bring down an entire ship. When they were successful, the attacks were devastating. Dozens of Zeros would attack groups of ships, always prioritizing aircraft carriers and other heavy vessels as best they could. Since they were sent on one-way missions, they could hypothetically travel at much further range, occasionally penetrating through enemy lines for hundreds of kilometers in order to find targets that had no reason to suspect an incoming attack. Often their pilots flew over small islands immediately before attacking, hugging the ground to avoid being picked up by radar. They were especially dangerous to the wooden flight decks of American carriers, and they supplemented ground battles in the Philippines, Okinawa, and elsewhere to devastating effect. Over the last years of the war, they sank 3 escort carriers, 14 destroyers, and dozens of other ships, killing a rough average of 2 Allied sailors for every kamikaze pilot who died. But yet again, the Allies managed to catch up to Japan's changing calculus and then find ways to get the upper hand. Commander John Thatch, already the progenitor of the Thatch weave that we described earlier, developed the so-called Big Blue Blanket technique, which shielded aircraft carriers and other high-value ships in multiple layers of defense. Destroyer escorts would sail at least 50 miles ahead of the carriers, using their radar to map the skies, while large, well-armed air patrols would move to intercept at any time a cloud of incoming Zeros was sighted. The Zero pilots were not ready for a dogfight, and they lacked ammunition and even the basic skills that might have otherwise helped them survive. When they ran into the Big Blue Blanket, most of them would be wiped out, with only a few able to break through to the carriers that were their real targets. And once they got to the carriers, they were faced with anti-aircraft gunners who were getting extremely good at target practice, and now they were armed with shells that could explode when they came into proximity to specific radio frequency sources that the Zeros were known to rely on. Japan attempted to adapt by sending their kamikazes after American B-29s, but these were a lot harder to catch and were very well armed, meaning that most of the relatively amateur kamikaze pilots were unable to find their targets. By the time Japan surrendered, the home islands hosted over 5,000 planes that were fitted for kamikaze use, many of which were the last remaining Zeros. But through the end of the war, only a small fraction of those kamikaze attacks were actually successful, and when Japan ultimately capitulated to the Allies, it spelled the end of the Zero service life. A few would pop up in Indonesia, some were sent off to museums, but most were disassembled or left to rot in jungle conditions where they'd been deployed. All in all, the Zero was an innovative design for its time and a significant advancement in aerial warfare, but like most other parts of Japan's rapid militarization, the Zero was dependent on a long list of trade-offs that were necessary in order to make it viable. And like most other parts of Japan's rapid militarization, those trade-offs would eventually become its undoing. But for a moment, even if just for a moment, the Zero was the best plane in the skies, and the planes that eventually rose up to defeat it probably wouldn't have ever existed if not for the threat of the Zero fighter.